This is Deadlink, a roguelite FPS that just very recently came onto early access, and is already pretty highly rated with like over 90% positive reviews as the way it goes right now, which is pretty cool. So how does it work, and how does it stand out? Because we all know that the roguelite genre is a very crowded one, there are tons and tons of them, and although there are fewer FPS ones, so that in and of itself actually does help it stand out a little bit by being a roguelite FPS, of which there are only some. As far as visuals and theming, it's going for a sort of cyberpunk type of aesthetic, as you can probably tell, and it pulls it off very well. The environments are very detailed and look great, and they're not too busy, which is sometimes a problem with Cyberpunk because there's often a lot of neon and greebly metal stuff everywhere, so it's easy for visuals to get kind of muddied in a Cyberpunk landscape, but in this case I think it's actually quite a clear visual experience, at least in my opinion. It's very easy to pick the enemies apart from the environment and things like that, probably because of the game's pretty clever use of color and shading. Things like the enemy models and the weapon models in this game use a sort of like flat shading kind of look to them, almost cel shaded but not quite, to the point that it makes everything stand out amongst the more photorealistic sort of detailed textures that everything else is composed of. So it has a really neat art style in my opinion, actually, because it's a little bit graphic novel-y with that combination of like pseudo-realistic textures with bombastic, flat-shaded, bright colors and stuff. So I think it looks pretty good. The music is also really, really nice in this game. It's actually quite the high point of it in my view. The battle music is just really good for getting you pumped up because this is a very fast-paced game, so that's exactly the sort of thing that you want, and the boss battle music is very nice as well. Now this is going for the room-by-room kind of roguelite, where the map is made up of a bunch of chambers that are connected via hallways, and you go from room to room and clear all the enemies out, and then to the next room, and eventually to the boss at the end of that particular floor. So it's a very familiar formula, but it's done quite well because the individual rooms themselves are very well composed. They are obviously handmade rooms. You can tell that there's a lot of hand design in these arenas so that they feel like really fun FPS arenas. They don't just feel like slaps together or overly procedural areas. Of course, the game does procedurally generate the order in which the rooms are actually connected, but the rooms themselves are clearly hand designed. And the design of these rooms takes a lot of advantage of verticality, of wide spaces where lots of double jumping and dashing is possible, and of a lot of mobility options based on said verticality and crossing those wide spaces. Because of the characters you can play, they all have a focus on different movement capabilities and things. So currently there are 2 characters you can play as. I believe the plan is to double that by the time the game launches to 4 characters, and the characters are frames, like robotic frames that you inhabit, and I gotta say, I think their kits are very well designed because they play completely differently from each other. Like, there is nothing similar about either of them at all. They are totally different playstyles, which is good because if you're going to have a smaller number of what are effectively like characters or classes, you want them to be very different. So one character, the one that you'll start with, has a shotgun that has 4 shots by default, very effective at close range as you would expect, but it also has, although it does obviously have fall off, it doesn't become useless at longer ranges, which I like. I hate it when games make shotguns like effectively pointless, just completely useless at anything below like melee range or above melee range, I mean, but in this case the shotgun's actually quite good. It's got a good amount of impact and it really does send enemies flying, so it feels really nice to use. It does have a rather prohibitively long reload animation though, so you do have to be careful about that. It takes a while to reload. You also have a rocket launcher as this character that holds 2 shots, and it is a very fast moving rocket, so it's really easy to lead targets with and blow them up. It does good damage, small AoE, really effective, also very fun to use. This character also has a movement ability on Q, which is a grappling hook that allows you to hook onto an enemy or these floating little robot drone things called C-bots. You can hook onto either one of them and just propel yourself across the arena. The really fun thing about the grappling hook is that you can actually use the directional keys and the mouse to sort of fling yourself in other directions aside from just towards what you're grappling on, which is always fun. And the classes also have an ability on the F key, which is like a character-specific skill, and in the case of the soldier, it is a force push, basically. It is a frontal AoE cone that pushes enemies, does a little bit of damage to them, marks them all, which we'll talk about marking in a second, and it also stuns things. It tends to stagger whatever it hits, which is extremely useful, especially when coupled, of course, with a shotgun, so that you can follow up with big shot to the face. And of course the grappling hook is also really good with the shotgun because it allows you to just propel yourself towards an enemy and then immediately shotgun them if you time it just right, which is also really fun. So yeah, that's good. The other class is more of a sort of squishy stealth focused class, you could say. They start with a revolver as their primary weapon. It has a nice fire rate, surprisingly short reload time, and it does very high headshot damage. So you want to be very precise with this thing, and it's also quite fun to use because of its precision. It tends to be like pinpoint accurate. You just have have to actually be accurate yourself, and you can really nail some satisfying headshots with it. Their secondary weapon is the arc cannon, which basically fires a horizontal blade of electricity forward that can hit several enemies and actually pierces through them. It's super fun to use, it does really good damage, but you only get 3 shots with it before you run out. Their movement ability is a blink that replaces you with a target. So you can either, just like the grappling hook, you can use it on enemies or on those floating C-bots, and it will switch places, and you'll automatically turn to face the enemy that you switched with, and it will also mark them. Very useful for blinking across the battlefield, very nice. And their other skill on F is a decoy. It places a sort of holographic decoy of them, which also turns you invisible for the duration that it's active on the battlefield, and it will mark enemies around it and eventually explode. So what is marking exactly? Well, marking is how you stay alive. In this game you have 2 different sort of health gauges. You have a shield gauge and a health gauge. Health is very difficult to replenish. There are only a couple of ways to do it, and it tends to take attention away from other things you could be doing to get more powerful, so ideally you really want your health gauge to stay full. But shield can be regenerated a lot more easily. It doesn't regen on its own naturally, but if you kill a marked enemy, they drop a whole bunch of shield power-ups. And you can use these to constantly keep your shield topped up, and this is why you want to mark as many enemies as possible. This is why all of your various abilities and your grenades mark enemies when they hit them, because you want to mark them to set them up for a combo kill to get a whole bunch of shield back. They also will sometimes drop some ammo when you kill a marked enemy. Now, you actually have infinite ammo for your primary weapon, but you do have to reload it. So picking up ammo for your primary doesn't replenish a stock of ammo. Instead, it puts it directly into the magazine and makes it take longer before you have to reload, which is interesting. And your secondary weapon, however, does actually have a limited ammo supply. However many shots it holds, either 2 or 3 by default, that's all you get. And you actually have to either kill marked enemies to replenish it or destroy those C-bots. That's actually mainly what they're for. Punching or grappling or whatever it is you do to a C-bot to blow it up will drop 2 charges of secondary ammo. There are also some more sort of arena shootery elements around the place. The game already feels very arena shooter-esque because you're shooting in arenas against large waves of spawning enemies, but there's also the fact that there are little power-ups that float around the place that you can find. There are blue power-ups for replenishing your primary ammo, so you don't have to reload at all for a minute. There are also some secondary power-ups and some temporary shield boosts that you can use as well. There are no health or normal shield power-ups though, so you have to replenish those either by getting some health pickups from going from room to room, or by killing marked enemies for your shield. Now, once you actually finish killing all the enemies in a room, you'll get a choice of doors that have different rewards. Sometimes you only have one choice, which is when there's a special, passive reward that you can get, but other times you will have a choice between 3 different doors that can contain things like shops to spend the various bits of money that you're getting, 2 bits of currency for the meta upgrade system that you can use when you're out of run and actually waiting to go on the next run, and there are also some other upgrades you can get, like upgrades to your frame's different skills, as well as weapon mods to alter how your weapons work within that run. But the one choice doors, the Neuromods, those are kind of a big deal because that's a central mechanic of the game. Basically, when you press tab, you get a list of 4 different things, different actions that your frame can do. And each of these actions will have a little battery symbol next to it with a number of segments lit up. So at first you'll have swapping weapons, which has 1 battery segment. Then you'll have using your movement skill or using your other active skill, both of which have 2 battery segments. And you'll have the 4th one, which is destroying a C-bot, which has 3 battery segments. And occasionally you'll find these neuromods that you can actually slot into little slots next to each of these actions, and they'll activate whenever you take that action, but you have to slot them in to an action that has the right number of battery slots. So you might have a neuromod that takes 3 battery capacity, which means the only one you can slot it into is the 4th one, for the breaking C-bots. Or you might have one that only takes 2 battery capacity, in which case you can slot it into one of the 2s or the 3, depending on what you have open at the time if you want to use it. So these mods are basically like your passive items from other roguelites. This is your build. This is your in-run build that you're creating for yourself. And these mods can be things like, every time you swap weapons, the next shot will electrify enemies, or you gain the ability to do toxic damage, or the next shot does 50% more damage if you destroy a C-bot, and things like that. There are all sorts of different passives that you can find, and you will want to equip them into all of your various slots to create a powerful build. That means you're always doing all of those actions, so the game encourages you to be constantly swapping weapons, constantly using both of them, constantly jetting around the place and using your skills, just never stopping, always moving and doing something. So you are meant to combine all these various passive effects. By the way, each of these neuromods actually has 2 effects. It has one sort of active thing that happens when you do the action that it's tied to, and it also has a passive effect that just always applies as long as it's equipped. So you're meant to combine those with the different weapon mods and class skill mods that you can find throughout the run and just get yourself strong enough to win. In the case of most rooms, you simply have to destroy all of the enemies in the room to move on, although occasionally you'll get to a survival room where you have to just survive an infinitely spawning wave of enemies for a certain amount of time, and then of course eventually there will be a boss fight at the end, and the boss fights are quite challenging but very fun. They look really cool visually, and they have a lot of different attacks for you to learn, as well as oftentimes spawning ads in the middle of the fight, and a good amount of health. So overall, I'd say it's a really solid roguelite FPS because its movement is really, really good and its shooting is very satisfying, and that's really all it's trying to do, right? It wants to be a very movement-focused, fast-paced, action-y shooter, and it does manage to do that very well. I love that both of the current frames available play completely differently, and I also like the fact that things like the weapon mods actually change the look of your weapons, which is a nice little touch. I just like how the weapons feel in general, but I think that the weapon mods actively altering the way they look, sometimes drastically to the point that they look like completely different weapons, is pretty cool. So what about the early access? What about things that I would change or bugs that I found? Well, for one, the game actually feels really, really polished, like surprisingly so, to the point that I haven't actually encountered any bugs myself yet. I haven't seen any sort of weirdness or broken animations or enemies phasing through the ground or any other stuff like that. The game has actually been pretty bug-free for me. However, there are a couple of things that I would like to see. For one, the environments can get a little bit samey, I will admit. This is the kind of problem that's going to fix itself over time as more content is added to the game, but it is something that I have to mention at the moment. The Cyberpunk aesthetics are very nice, and the arenas do look quite good, but you will see all of them relatively quickly, and the areas can get a bit samey because of that, so that's something to keep in mind. The other thing is, I kind of feel like the enemy health might scale up just a little bit too fast. I think that the enemies become too bullet spongy too quickly sometimes, and it can lead to situations in which the combat isn't as satisfying later as it starts, because you'll start like one-shotting enemies with one shotgun blast, but then you'll quickly find yourself taking like 3 full magazines of shotgun blasts to kill a single enemy, and this actually happens so fast that we're talking like before the first boss it ramps up like this. I think it ramps up a little bit too fast. There are certain enemies like these sumos and the geishas that are massive threats. I don't think they're overpowered. I think they're actually a good amount of threat. Like, I think they make sense as enemies, but I think that because the enemy health scaling is so drastic, these enemies are overly spongy and too difficult to deal with. They're not too difficult because they do too much damage. They're too difficult because they take so long to kill that it's actually kind of ridiculous sometimes. I think that right now the game's scaling in terms of its enemy health is actually so drastic that if you're not playing one incredibly specific kind of build, i.e. stacking as much elemental damage as possible, then you're probably going to lose. And I think that's sort of unfortunate because a game like this lives on its variety. It thrives on its build variety. That's the point. So railroading you into doing one specific kind of build because the enemy health scaling just goes crazy at a certain point is a little bit unfortunate, and I think I would honestly like to see either we get more powerful in general more quickly so that we can keep up with them, or the enemy health scaling is toned down a little bit so enemies don't quite become so spongy so quickly. But yeah, that's my current view on Deadlink as it has launched into early access. I think it's in a really good spot, it is nicely polished, and has a lot of fun content on offer, and I'm excited to see what actually comes next, especially in terms of the new playable characters, considering how different the two we already have are, so that's nice. It is very well rated currently on Steam for a reason, so we'll definitely have to keep an eye on how it goes from here. The link, of course, will as always be in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you wish to check it out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.